There is no obligation on man to recognize the Logos just because he is man. The same immanent lawful order and justice reveals itself in the highest and the wrongest man. But if we press upon Heraclitus the question of why fire is not always fire, why it is sometimes water and sometimes earth, he could only say, it is a game. Don't take it so pathetically. And above all, don't make morality of it. Nietzsche's quote here about Heraclitus is a good introduction to Terrence Malick's film Days of Heaven, which I wish to offer here is a tragedy of hearing and listening. Logos is an ancient word that has come to mean many things. Its lasting meaning for us today is the Christian notion of the Word of God prior to the arrival of Jesus Christ, through whom God speaks. But before this, in Heraclitus' time, Logos is the order of the cosmos that must be listened to for wisdom to come. This Logos isn't a command, it isn't a word or the word, it is the collision and strife of all life. Don't listen to me, Heraclitus says. Listen to the Logos. In Nietzsche's reading of Heraclitus, the Logos of collisions and strife constitutes a grand cosmic game. Logos isn't God's command. There's no such divine harmony to appeal to in times of strife. Nature does not determine outcomes. Nous is the Greek term for cosmic intelligence, but Logos is not consciousness. It does not care, certainly not for anything we might call ethics, or any social construction of morality. Violence comes to everyone in its own way, and in the end, good people and bad people all meet the same death. Terrence Malick's film Days of Heaven expresses this idea. In this video, I'll explore the tragedy that unfolds when Logos is ignored. In Malick's cinema, nature is inseparable from human. All entities, conscious or not, are wrapped within the same cycle of violence, death, and rebirth. To listen to the Logos is to engage in what is common to all. But its resonances must be sought out, its signs attended to. Days of Heaven is a tragedy about a failure to listen to all that is available to be heard. What we hear in life is sound. What we hear in a movie is a mix. The mix is the dynamic process of weaving together all audible elements. These elements are typically divided into three categories: voices, music, and sound effects. We cannot attend to everything at once, so it must be mixed. Put another way, we cannot hear everything, so the mixing engineer directs our listening. Here we can return to the ancient Greek concept of nous. Again, it's a prior intelligence, Plato's demiurge, the builder of the cosmos. This comes in the relationship between a film director and a mixing engineer. What is audible, that is, what is heard and listened to, and whom is listening, is determined by this relationship. Conceived as nous, there is a transcendence to mixing, a divinity, the director, mixer, demiurge designing what can be listened to. In our everyday world, we pluck streams of listening from our hearing. A film does this for us. The craft of mixing manages the chaos for an audience. A mix creates beds of hearing and threads of listening within the whole in time. It establishes everyday generalities while emphasizing emerging particularities. A film is nous, demiurgical, if it is conceived as a film, a work of art, an Aristotelian poetics. A film is logos if it is instead an experience. That is, if we conceive instead that within itself, in its own world, people are hearing and listening. Nothing is directed here, because these are people living their lives. They are the ones who hear, and who must do their own listening. This is the Heraclitean play, the artful interplay of the general and the particular, the common and its collisions, the ruptures that emerge from within the character's habitual existence. When a mix is done well, the characters' lives and the audience's appreciation harmonize. The audience gathers and takes account, hears and listens along with the character. These words, gathering an account, are the ancient translation of logos. There is a narrative element to logos. The cosmos exists on its own. Only that which is gathered becomes a story. A mix that only represents the concrete nature of reality does not gather. This is technique, not art. In an artful mix, the gathering is more question than answer. Mixing as an art is the mixing that one does. An artful mix builds empathetic circuits as an assumed audience comes to inhabit the logos gathered by the characters within. Rather than what is sounding, the question becomes what hearing is underway, what is being listened to, what is forgotten and sent into silence. Days of Heaven is a film about hearing, about failures to gather and take account in listening. The story centers around the character of Bill, who begins the film in the midst of noise, a hell of industry and modernity. Bill is Plato's cave dweller. But the difference in Malick's story is that he confronts the fire of his repetition. He is not chained to illusion. He knows his imprisonment. He faces the fire that exploits him for labor. Bill kills a man and ends his cycle. He escapes and finds himself in heaven, emerging from the audible and tactile nightmare of the coal furnaces and the punishing, undifferentiated repetitions of modernity, technology, and exploitation. Bill has found his liberation. He has emerged into Plato's virtuous world of forms. On the farm, the only fire is the setting sun, dispersed across the horizon. Bill, with a stem of wheat in his mouth, wears a simple smile, bright eyes shining in the glow of the magic hour. Here the light bathes him in a state of reflection, and occasionally streams through the clouds as divine revelation. Around him, the imperceptible hum of locusts and the whisper of the breeze provide an audible embrace that is easily accepted and ignored. This transcendence into heaven hides an imperceptible chaos, an unseen imminent activity of change and differentiation. What the characters of Days of Heaven will come to learn is that heaven and hell are not fixed places, but emergences, each capable of inhabiting the other and arising from within the same world. In Book 10 of Plato's Republic, one finds Socrates' story known as the myth of air. In it, he mentions 4 passageways of Tartarus, 2 in the earth and 2 in the sky, 1 each coming and going. Judges preside over these entry and departure points. Those coming from the heavens expressed bliss, those of the earth were sorrowful. The most lamentable of souls waiting to come up to judgment, such as murderers, would not be allowed out of Tartarus. If a soul was refused the passage into heaven, the mouth would roar a terrible sound, while those granted the right to ascend only hear silence. At the moment of the roar, fiery figures would take away each unfortunate soul or beat them. Air says that hearing the roar was every soul's greatest fear. Those who ascend earn salvation in the light that binds the universe together. It comes in a great meadow, where one eventually sees a single shaft of light through the clouds, which Socrates calls the spindle of necessity. The sirens sing a single note in perfect 8-part harmony. In Bill's hell of the factory, the sound present was the roar of oppression, pulsing in cycles of unchanging succession, disallowing conversation. Reason, their means of connecting with one another, is masked by the roar. In the wheat fields, all is quiet and bathed in sunlight, a single note of harmony produced by the ambient multitude of soft locusts humming in unison. In this moment of Bill standing alone in the open, the machinery has stopped, and the wind breathes over the wheat in a sonic event that feels tactile. In this place, the logos of the film world is the common, the open breath of a relative silence that signals no need for attention. Over the next hour of story time, the film reveals in other susurrations. There is little dialogue, being as it is unnecessary in heaven. Silence, vital in Malick's logos, offers the opportunity to forget and to allow the opening of the new. But silence is not a total absence. Something hides in this tranquility, a presence that is audible, yet undifferentiated. This place has a singular ambience, the harmony of the spindle, the murmur of harmless locusts. It is a sign that no one in the film attends to. Everything goes wrong in 3 stages of audibility: hearing, listening, and nomos. Philosophically, we are aided by 3 terms that reflect these 3 states: firstness, secondness, and thirdness. These terms originate with the American philosopher Charles Peirce, and were modified by French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. What's interesting about Days of Heaven is in how these 3 elements unfold in sequence. There is first hearing, second listening, and third nomos. The firstness of hearing is passive when it is gathered as passive. That is to say, hearing and firstness relate to the everyday. We can think of raw sensation, the ambience that surrounds us. But there is a newness to it as well that suggests the secondness to come in listening. Deleuze writes that firstness, quote, is felt rather than conceived, end quote. He continues that it is what is new in experience, fleeting and nevertheless eternal. It comprises the signs that emerge, quote, independently of any question of their actualization. Firstness, he adds, is for itself and in itself, the undifferentiated, and a quality of possibility. Firstness and hearing occur at the level of affect. In Days of Heaven, we find 2 manifestations of a first-order hearing: the hellfire of the factory and the quiet of the wheat fields. The factory churns in its linear, plodding, steaming rhythm. Its continuity is so loud and so psychologically punishing that its continuous density of firstness hearing drowns out any possibility of rational discourse. Secondness listening, toward an appeal to the thirdness of law or nomos. Firstness hearing has nothing to do with loudness. The punishment of the factory is loud while the wheat fields are quiet. Firstness and hearing instead describe a lack of differentiation. In both environments, there is nothing to listen to. In the wheat fields, the ambience of the locusts upon Bill's arrival early in the film is the firstness of ambient sound, a pervasive, audible connection to place. The difference between the hell of the former and the heaven of the latter is that only the second allows for the newness that Deleuze writes of. The presence of the locust is first heard. It is neither seen nor attended to. All within the film can hear it, but do not listen. There is no need, no difference, no threat. Yet the nature expressed here doesn't entirely supplant the squealing, punishing industry Bill left behind. The churn of the factory returns intermittently in the film, in the form of machines. It is a revisitation of industry and its manufactured rhythms, heard in the swishing, slicing violence of the automated thrashing machine, so dominant and threatening in the mix. It is in the heft of the coal-fired train cars, pulsing their way through the fields. In their simultaneous soundings, there is not one rhythm, but 2. A continual polymeter that strays and rejoins its maddening artificial entrainment. It calls back in suggestions to Bill's prior hell in the factory, in echoes of the noise of confinement and the incomprehensibility of it. Hell not only cycles back to him, but it returns in its cycles, the unthought memory of the cycle he left behind. Tartarus, Plato's hell, sounds also in heaven. As the movie continues, and the collective pathos becomes more tense, the principal characters in Days of Heaven find themselves consumed by their attachments of jealousy, guilt, and distrust. Stuart Kendall writes that as the film moves along, it becomes a movie about watching. But it's also a film about not seeing and not listening. Each character carries an inaudible noise of thought, a busy, scheming inner listening devoid of hearing, that further masks the unseen threats. This is the source of the film's tragedy. Bill throughout is locked up in maintaining his deception, which along the way also morphs into regret and jealousy. His girlfriend Abby's complicit role merges into a sustained guilt. The farmer is not only blinded by his cycle of love and suspicion, but muted to all else in the process. Only Linda keeps her senses attuned, even as she too fails to listen. But she is the first to see the change. In a good screenplay, 2 crises reveal themselves simultaneously. In Days of Heaven, the first is the romantic deception. It's interesting that this is revealed to the farmer as he stands next to the noisy hum of the weather vane, a symbol for a masked capacity to listen, that is, to understand. The second is the visual unfolding of the locusts, a threat that was always heard but never listened to. When the two come together, we find three terms from Aristotle's Poetics in collision. There is the Peirce, that is, the arrival or the apocalypse. The second is anagnoresis, or discovery. This discovery unfolds as a peripeteia, or a reversal. Anagnoresis in Aristotle is associated with knowledge, which for Aristotle could be spoken or seen. In Days of Heaven, both understandings are seen, but they could have been brought out into conscious listening. Instead, they were ignored. Nature hides, as Heraclitus wrote, but it also reveals. At times, it comes in as a force, forcing one to attend. Linda sees the locusts, and soon we all hear what was unlistened. The mix gives the audience what was unlistened as hell is unleashed. Bill's hell was never left behind. It followed him, hid, and now emerges as a conflagration that burns everything. Even Ennio Morricone's organic orchestra at this point cycles in mechanical patterns in strings and woodwinds, taking on a synthesized quality. Audibility now enters secondness listening within the denial of closure. As with the beginning of the film, hearing becomes noise as characters confront each other openly. The two streams of Peirce now exposed. They converge and become one in a blaze of fire. "Let it burn," the farmer yells, speaking not only of his farm but his entire world and all within it, including himself. In this secondness is a listening that never had the chance to occur in hearing. It never turned over to a relation that might lead to some understanding. Now the noise of hell has found them all, and they are helpless as the world burns. We now come to thirdness in Peirce, the association of law. We don't mean here law as in laws of the books. This is a different kind of law. We situate it here with the Greek law of nomos, because nomos thirdness is the element of thinking or reasoning that falls outside of the audible engagement without fully abandoning it. In this sense, logos is an engagement that has nomos as its outcome. In Heraclitus, nomos is inseparable from nature. This is not so much the natural law of essences, rather nomos composes into law, a law of nature always in flux. A logos relation of nomos is a signifying network that traverses along a field of laws as a gathering rather than an a priori divine determinant of understanding, which would be nous. Nomos' thirdness expresses a listening that finds its interpretation, one that is different from the man-made laws of language and visible understanding. Thirdness is the act of deciding. An audible thirdness is a decision that interprets and infers. Audibility gives way to the negotiations of rational thought. Here nomos, as the etymology suggests, is doled out in territories of thinking. And yet, as Peirce and Deleuze write, each stage in this process of understanding does not abandon the previous stage. Firstness comes to occupy secondness, which occupies thirdness. This is wisdom. A thirdness that excludes the prior two is dogma, fixed thought, an abuse of power. In an audible sense, any decision about what one has heard and listened to need not stop at inferring law. One can still integrate the durations of hearing and sensation, listening and its wealth of signs, in a way that keeps nomos learning and growing. This finally brings us back to logos. Without the continued attentiveness of listening to the logos, nomos dies under the weight of categories and preconceptions, or it becomes abused by agents of power. To relate as logos is to seek along the openness of hearing that invites an authentic listening within movement and activity of law. In other words, the locusts can be gathered as conceivable, as actionable. This is Bill's failure. There's nothing much that could have been done. Malick always integrates some element of fate. But in his arrival to heaven, he thought his hell was over. He had no interest in hearing or listening. He felt he had fixed the problem. So he moved on to scheming for more, manipulating the farmer to achieve his own advantage. He does not gather in a Heraclitean harmony of collisions, buried unseen all around him. When his hell reemerges, it is born of the logos unlistened. Not nomos, but nature that forces its own distribution, which from time to time must bring forth from the fire that illuminates a need to burn, a roar of destruction. The logos ripples in sound and hearing. The apocalypse is unseen and unforeseen, announcing itself always in murmurs, even if it does not yet actualize in the mind. Bill never changed. He never truly entered into the newness of this same world. He didn't listen to what was new. Then again, neither did the farmer. Both were closed up in their pre-existing determinations, an approach to law fixed and unchanged in their own minds. This is the challenge Malick's characters often face, the need to break the straight lines of seeing and listening without falling back into a return of sameness or identity that leads to despair.